Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at Roman numerals. Now, for something so old, they're still found surprisingly often in our modern world. So you might have noticed things like clock faces, even Roman inscriptions, which aren't necessarily modern, but you've seen them there. Maybe on the first few pages of your textbook, you've noticed Roman numerals are still used, or something like the Super Bowl, right? So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to unpack the basics of Roman numerals. Now, there's a lot more we could go into with this, but we're just going to get the basics that if you're a Latin student, working through a textbook and you're trying to understand it, this will give you the basics so you can at least use them, count them, know what numbers they represent. But I'd highly encourage, if you want to learn more about the origins, there's some really good videos out there that do a great job of explaining it. I'd encourage you to check them out. Okay? So where do we begin, right? Where do Roman numerals come from? Well, if you're like me, the option that I was taught early on is that they come from counting on your hands, which seems pretty simple, right? You just add up, one for one is one finger. Holding up five fingers might be V, right? This is the basics that a lot of us were taught. Pretty wild. But there are some flaws in this plan, right? So if you use this system and try to count, you'll see that it probably wasn't the case. So certain Roman numerals just don't add up to being something that you're counting on your hand. So the more modern version that I learned personally later on, after I got past it not being on your hand, is that it comes from the Etruscan counting system, right? Which is really based on tally marks. So that's what you're looking at. When you dive into Roman numerals, you're looking at the idea of writing out tally marks and using different symbols to represent numbers. So how does it all work? Well, it's still pretty basic. So the Roman numeral for one is just one tally mark, right? We usually see it depicted as what we'd call a capital I, okay? And if you go by counting on your hand theory, be careful which one you hold up, right, when you're doing one. Two is just two tally marks, and three is just three tally marks. And again, if you're going with your hands, be careful which one you hold up when you're holding up three fingers, okay? This just makes a lot of sense to us. And again, this is where you can see the idea of counting on your fingers really does make a lot of sense for what this is, even though it's not quite that. But what about the rest of them? And this is where it starts to get a little more interesting, okay? So the Roman numeral for five is a V shape. So that theory of counting on your hands, I remember when I was younger, I learned that if you hold up your hand, the V is the shape that you get when you're looking at your thumb and your index finger, right? The sort of negative space between your thumb and your index finger when you hold up five fingers, and that's five, okay? But the Etruscan model gives you a different answer, okay? So let's just jump ahead a little bit to X, which represents 10. In the Etruscan tally mark system, the X, or which is really two lines, right? It represents the tens place. Okay, so the general idea of this theory is that the X is representing a two-digit number, and it makes it easier than writing out all those different tally marks. So if you're using that as the logic, and again, there's a lot of really good videos that dive into the sort of theory more behind this. But if you're using that logic of X representing sort of two decimal places, now come back to the five and you can see that the V is really half of an X, okay? So that makes a lot of sense and kind of helps you see where this comes from. So it's not necessarily holding up two hands and doing some sort of odd gesture with your two hands to make an X. It's really more the idea that if we say X is 10, right? Half of 10, if you just cut the X in half, you get a V, okay? So the basics are pretty straightforward, right? One digit is a 1, V is 5, and X is 10. Those are the basic building blocks. But now you need to get into a little more to understand where the rest of the numbers are coming from. So generally speaking, Roman numerals are additive, meaning that if you just take one tally mark and put another, you get two, and keep adding, you'll get 3 and 4 and all these different things, okay? So you're just adding smaller numbers to get higher ones. There are certain occasions, though, where subtraction is actually used, and the most famous of it is the number 4. So if you're looking at the number 4 here, the general idea is that you're starting with the larger number, the V, and if you put a tally to the left, you're representing subtraction. So IV is really V, which is 5, minus 1. So 5 minus 1 is 4. Okay. The problem with this is that there's more than one way to write the number 4. So if we come back to it, it's often actually written with 4 tally marks. Okay. And I've heard a great theory that the IV is really more something you'll see on like epitaphs or on stone when there's limited space. But when you're reading actual Latin, you see this a lot. The number 4 is I'd say really commonly used as just 4 tally marks. So that's where it makes it a little confusing. Which is the right answer? Well, it's a little hard to unpack that, right? So do you write out 4 lines? Do you do 5 minus 1? It's a little confusing. And this is part of the reason why we don't use Roman numerals anymore, okay? Here's another example of that sort of alternate using different types of subtraction. This is the epitaph of a centurion, Marcus Caelius. Okay, you can see his name written on his funerary grave here, right? And if you look at it, it's marking that he was a centurion in the 18th Legion. And the number that's been carved, you can actually see it right in sort of the middle of the inscription, is XIIX, which represents 18. Now that's a little weird because we would expect it would be XVIII, right? 10 plus 5 plus 3, which is what you see in a lot of different textbooks. So how is it XIIX here, right? What's going on? Well, this is a variant that we know the 18th Legion used, where it's using IIX as the number 8. So in other words, XIIX represents 10, that's the first X, and then the X to the right is another 10 with subtracting 2 in the middle, right? So now you have X plus 10 minus 2, right? So in other words, 10 plus 10 minus 2 equals 18. The point of this is to show you that there's not always one specific way to write out Roman numerals, which makes it a little confusing, right? Which is why when you're learning Roman numerals, it's a little bit safer if you're a beginning Latin student, maybe in Latin 1, wherever you come across this, to just stick with the basics. And the basics look like this. Okay, when you're coming to subtraction, the standard subtractive forms are these. You have the number 4, which is 5 minus 1. You have the number 9, which is 10 minus 1. You have the number 40, which is L, which is 50 minus 10, right? So L minus X. Then you have the number 90, which is 100, C, centum, minus 10. You have 400, which is D, 500, minus 100. And you have 900, which is M, 1,000, minus 100, okay? So this is where, again, it gets a little bit tricky and a little bit confusing. But when it comes to doing that method of subtraction is moving left, right? These are the most common ones, the standard ones that you see. So it's not that you can use any number to do subtraction. Although, like I said, in the epitaph of Marcus Caelius that we just saw, there is an alternate for 18, which again just makes it kind of confusing. The more common form is the additive one, which is the idea of putting something to the right to show addition. So 6 would be VI, right? 5 plus 1. So when you add all this up, the idea of doing subtraction to get 4 and really doing addition to get the rest of the numbers, when you get the numbers 1 through 10, they look like this. So you have 1, 2, and 3 are just tally marks, right? I, and I. 4 is 5 minus 1, so IV. V is 5, right? Which we saw in the Etruscan system. X is 10, so V is half of 10, right? We're just kind of putting placeholders here. If you're doing the additive system, which we are, right? 6 would be VI, 5 plus 1. 7 would be VII, which is 5 plus 2. And 8 would be VIII, which is 5 plus 8. And remember, this is sort of the basic standard because we've seen you can tweak this a little bit. But in general, this is how you do it. 9 is one of our standard subtractive numbers, right? So it's really 10 minus 1. And then again, we have 10, right? X. So these are the numbers 1 through 10. And again, this will get you 99% of the way in a Latin textbook if you're a starting out Latin student. But these are the ones you want to use because you can take these and then build whatever number you really need, honestly, okay? Now, the other numbers that you do want to be aware of are LCDM. And again, these numbers are part of the reason why counting on your hands don't make a ton of sense, because if you do that, there's really no logical reason where you'd get L for 50 or D for 500. Like, it just doesn't quite add up. But there are a few that do make sense here. So C is the first word of centum, right? Which kind of makes sense, C being 100, although there is sort of a variant of that too. And the M is usually said to represent mille, meaning 1,000, okay? But LCDM, however you want to break it down, are numbers you do want to know, particularly if you're starting out, right? L is 50, C is 100, D is 500, and M is 1,000. So if you put these together, now you can see that you can basically put, with these basic building blocks, these 14 Roman numerals, when you do 1 through 10 plus these, you can make whatever number you want, right? And it gets a little simpler from there. So hopefully this is making some sense, right? We're not too confused yet. Just take these basic Roman numerals, add them up, and you can make whatever number you need. So for instance, if you want to make the number 2024, you would write it as MMXXIV, right? So there's 2 M's, so 1,000 plus 1,000. You have 20, which is 10 plus 10, right? The 2 X's in the middle. And then you have IV. And since IV, 4 is one of those subtractive numbers, what you're really doing is V, which is 5, minus 4, okay? But again, you can see already that if this is the system we kept using, it would be very confusing because there's not just one way to write a number. Okay, this is why we don't use it. We use Arabic numerals now, where you have every symbol represents a specific number, and you can see that there are times where this actually causes some problems. Okay, so I mentioned the Super Bowl, which is one of the biggest sporting events in the U.S. Right? When it came to Super Bowl 50, you might have noticed they didn't put the Roman numeral there, right? So instead, they went to Arabic numerals. Why? Because 50 we just learned is L, and no one wants to put L and associate it with the Super Bowl. So they actually switched it up. It's the only Super Bowl that is not using Roman numerals, right? Because they didn't want that L association. So they went to Arabic. So Super Bowl 50 is literally written out as 50, which is just an odd sort of a little side note to when we might use Roman numerals. Okay, so to wrap this all up, the basic Roman numerals again, you have I, V, X, L, C, D, M, right? With those, if you know what they mean, you get the basics of those. Certain occasions where you do subtraction, the rest is really addition. You can make any number you want out of these, right? At least for a Roman or a Latin textbook, rather, right? You're not really going to run into a number you won't understand. They're pretty basic. When you're writing out a number, you always start with the larger numeral, right? So in other words, if you want to write 11, start with X, 10, and add 2, or sorry, add 1 rather. That's the general idea. Putting a number to the right is showing the addition, while putting a number to the left for certain numbers shows the subtraction. Okay. The thing that we want to know though is there are several ways to write numbers. I showed you that before, like with the number 4, and that makes it confusing. That's why we don't use these Roman numerals so much today. We've gone to Arabic numerals. So you just want to pay attention to that because there's not necessarily only one way to write everything out. Sometimes it gets a little tricky. Okay. But if you follow these basics, you should be able to understand Roman numerals without too much trouble. If you have any questions at all, feel free to put them in the comments below. I'm happy to help you out. But otherwise, like I said, dive in a little bit, particularly on YouTube. There's some really, really good videos that'll show you the more modern idea of the Etruscan numbers and where Roman numerals come from. I'd encourage you to dive into that, right? It might help you, if you're into it, it'll help you kind of really understand where these come from. But if you're just trying to understand the numerals to get through Latin class, this should be enough to get you there. Good luck.